Right. What I'll do today is basically give a little overview of how we've got to where we are, a little bit of a review of what we do, what we could do better, and where we could possibly go in the future. I think one of the concerns about coming to a meeting like this, and particularly in my job, is you just look at deaths and you think everyone's dying from operations, it's terrible. But actually, surgery is pretty safe. Looking at the VASM data and the national data is over 20,000 deaths over the last 10 years or so. Overall mortality is sort of plateaued down to about 3 per 1,000 procedures, which is pretty good. And as we've seen earlier on, most of those, there isn't actually an issue. Most of the people that are dying are usually very old, multiple comorbidities, and often emergencies. So there's very few of the ones we really would be worried about, which is young elective patients die. So I think we've got to get that message out there that it's really, surgery is safe. It's interesting, I think we're often compared with the airline industry. If they had a mortality rate like that, they'd obviously be, they'd be horrified. It'd be basically a plane crashing every day. So the airline industry has different presses to what we have. But equally, I think the other thing we've got to realize is that we deal with people who are going to die anyway. We all die. And if you look at the mortality rate of someone who is 75 to 85, their life expectancy is about 3 in 1,000 to live the next month. So for the elderly people, we are still getting fantastic results. So in terms of the ones we're concerned about, it's about 12 concerns per 100,000 procedures. So there's not that much room for us to get better, to get towards this targeting zero. It'd be nice to get that down to 0 per 100,000, but 12's not bad, but we could do a little bit better. Now, things do go wrong, and I've just looked this up. You can read those to your heart's content. These are all real cases. Some of you might recognize them from elsewhere, but basically elderly people being operated on by junior doctors and medical students, people not getting consultant involvement, people not getting DVT prophylaxis, all fairly horrible things. And the good news about all of those is that, A, not from Australia, they're from the UK, and also they are slightly elderly. This is probably the granddaddy of all the audits produced. This is the first ever CPOD report back from 1987. I think anyone that was working in the UK around about that time, particularly in surgery, would have heard of these reports and would have heard of those horrible cases. And I was working in the northern region at the time where we think that aneurysm operation was done. So everyone was pointing fingers and saying, who the hell did this and where did it go wrong? So this is where they started doing the audit sort of things. And from this, the National CPOD Office came out, and then I think the Scottish Mortality Audit came out, and everything has mushroomed on from there. But as all good reports have, it did have a whole load of recommendations. So these are the 1987 recommendations. And you can think, well, quite a few of those things are applicable today. If we bring it up to today, this is the report that we released last week. The surgeons in the room, it'd be interesting to see how many people have read the report. Hands up. It's pretty good, but there again, you're a selected audience who actually are interested in this sort of thing. So, it's quite nice reading. So that's the previous recommendations, and if you look at the recommendations in our report, there's not that much of a difference, actually. And it's a bit of a shame that 30-odd years has gone between the two, and yet we're still saying the same things, particularly regarding operating in futile cases and getting perioperative care sorted out. The last point has changed a little bit. I think we do audit ourselves, and we are aware of what's going on. And now what we're saying is communication has got to be improved. This comes down to handovers and writing notes and making sure it all happens. And I think it's a little bit ironic that it's much easier to communicate nowadays. We've got mobile phones, we've got SMS, we've got social media, and yet the communication in many ways is worse. I was chatting to someone earlier. We've sent out the email with this report last week, but we don't know how many people read it. Al Saunders, who was here earlier, I was chatting to him last year, and he says, well, I send out all this stuff from my office saying I want the surgeons to do this in our organization, but I haven't got a clue who's actually reading it and who's working on it. And I think the sort of face-to-face communication, actually talking to people, has gone out the window a little bit. Having a nice big copy of a report and flicking through it and thinking, well, that's interesting, has gone out the window as well. We just send it out willy-nilly, expecting people to read stuff and go through it and act on it, but they don't, because they're just overwhelmed with so many things coming into their inboxes. So I think we've got to improve our communication, both as an organisation and as clinicians. This is the audit loop. So we're hoping to we keep on setting goals and we keep on reporting back on things, and we hope to make a difference by implementing change at the end. So you're all aware of that. And I think we do it quite well. Okay, I'm biased. I've just come to this organisation, but I'm not the only one. We have had external reports saying that VASM does a pretty good job. So we're fairly confident that we are doing our aspects quite well, but it might not be quite getting out there. And this is how we do things. We have meetings like this, which is on the bottom. We send out our reports. We send out individual surgeons' reports if they want them. We send out reports to hospitals. So we're sending out a lot of stuff, and we're identifying all sorts of things, and we hope that we're making a bit of a difference, as Claudia said earlier. The mortality rate was going down, maybe it's plateaued a little bit, but we're possibly making a bit of a difference, which is good. This is the latest one, which came out last year, and I think this is a very good document, and it goes to what's been said earlier in the day. A lot of these things, the problems with deaths and morbidity, can be discussed locally. And so the college has set out guidelines of how it should be done. Now, certainly in the organisation I work at, I don't think we even get anywhere near bronze. So we should be moving towards bronze, silver and gold. We should all be aspiring to getting gold morbidity, mortality meetings. And why shouldn't we? But again, I think this was sent out. If I go and chat to my colleagues, I bet you a lot of them are completely oblivious to this document. So it's up to us to then go out and say, okay, let's be champions of this. Let's make a difference. Let's really go for this sort of thing. There are a few things we don't do so well, and Ewan alluded to this earlier. We're not picking up all the deaths that are out there, all the surgical deaths. Now, some of that will be because they're not actually surgical deaths. So the VAD data, which is all the deaths collected by the government, will include deaths following endoscopies and colonoscopies, which are done by procedural people and gastroenterologists. It won't pick up the interventional bits and pieces, and it won't pick up the cardiology deaths. In many ways, it should, and it'd be really nice if we could get all that data, but that really widens our remit quite a bit. We'd have to get cardiologists and gastroenterologists on board to do the assessments. So it's a whole percentage, and that percentage is probably getting bigger and bigger and bigger as more and more of these procedures are being done and more people are dying from the procedures. So I think Ewan's been a little bit disingenuous by saying we're not picking up all the deaths or our mortality is fairly plateaued. So a lot of it is actually out of our hands at the moment, but that needs to be reviewed as well. The other thing we're not probably doing as well as we could do is data collection. And of course, what we do in our reports is convert words and tick boxes into often numbers, which are then put into computer programs so that we can get the whole system reviewed. And we're reliant very much on an old system. I think they're still using the same system as was used 10 years ago, based on read codes for our data collection. And what we'd love to do is move on to the more modern. SNOMED is the sort of updated read system, which the UK is trying to move on to. It's an internationally recognized coding system. So I think in many ways we'd love to move on to that, but there's going to be expenses involved, and it's going to have to be done across the whole country, not just in Victoria. So data collection is an issue and data management's an issue, but we are looking at that, and we probably can do better. And then it comes to the sort of the vexed question of qualified privilege, which again has been alluded to today. We are bound by qualified privilege. And if you don't know what qualified privilege is, it basically means that we have de-identified data. We send de-identified data out to the assessors, and everything we produce is de-identified, so that you can't say, well, this is so-and-so from that hospital and he's done that. But as Ewan mentioned earlier, it does have an issue in that when problems are found, we can't then give the information back to anybody else, saying, well, you've got a surgeon who's doing horrible operations, getting horrible results, you should be doing something about it, which is frustrating for Safer Care Victoria, because they'd like to be able to act on that if they could. But it's the law. We can't at the moment. So there are moves afoot to try and change the qualified privilege and go to a Victorian law as opposed to a Commonwealth law. But you've then got to think, okay, well, that's is that going to work? Are surgeons going to be happy to report if they're no longer anonymous? Are they going to be happy to put down what their real thoughts are? Are assessors going to be happy to say, I completely disagree with what that guy's done, if their name's going to be out there in the community as well? And these are sort of all sorts of questions. You could, the GMC case with the paediatrician is a case in point, and what was thought to be confidential information at a review within the hospital was then given to a court and used against her, and she ended up accused of manslaughter from that. So we've got all these sorts of issues to face. And then does it become a punitive thing, or are we straying from our educational goal? So they're all difficult questions. And I mean, QP, which I must admit I'd hardly heard of before I took the job on, has become the overarching worry in our department. And we're a bit concerned we might be beaten over the head a little bit by the Victorian government, who fund us, saying, well, we want the data. I can understand where they're coming from, but we are a little bit, well, we're bound by the law. So you saw earlier the plots of the hospitals which are being released to all the hospitals, and they are de-identified to the hospital concerned, but not to everybody else. We could go further. We could look at specialties and say, okay, this is a specialty report, and you pick up outliers from this in the same sort of way. And it's the sort of thing that UM would like and Safer Victoria would like. In many ways, it's good for us as well. We could go to the outliers and say, well, you're not doing quite as well as some of the others. How can we help you? Or go to the underliers and say, okay, how can you help these other people? But we can't currently really do this with the qualified privilege concerns. And also because we don't have the denominator. We don't know how many procedures are being done by all these sort of people. We can get data for the whole of the state on or how many procedures in total are being done, but we probably can't drill down to how many, for example, colectomies or right hemicolectomies are being done over the whole state, so we get denominators for each of the hospitals. And that's going to be a big problem. You may find that the one that's getting 80 deaths has only done 80 of the operations, even though they hit that line, because they're not actually having problems with their reports. So denominator is an issue, and the hospitals themselves should have a better idea what's going on. We could go further. We could produce individual surgeon reports, but it's got the same issue. We don't know denominator. We really can't use the data because of qualified privilege. And mortality is a very, very crude assessor of how good a surgeon is, whether they really are any good at doing what they're doing. So a mate of mine, Raj Singh, and Tim O'Brien produced a nice paper a few years ago from Guy's Hospital, where they did a statistical analysis, and they said you could probably have 4 patients on the trot dying from certain major surgery, and you still wouldn't be an outlier. So we're better off probably looking at the complications and looking at a whole systems area rather than just a very crude assessment of deaths. Yes, there are lessons to be learned from deaths, but there is a lot more information that we can be gathering from all of this. There are national, international areas involved in these changes, and we will keep on going along with whatever's pushed out there. We are bound really by the Australia, New Zealand ASMs as well, so we can't go out on a limb. We have to do everything on their recommendations, and we can't change the forms, and we can't change the way things are done without their permission. And obviously, if they suggest something, we will do it, and the same from any international benchmarking that comes out there. So that's going to make something we'll look at in the future. So in summary, this is what we're doing. We are producing all sorts of reports and feedbacks, and in certain areas we probably can improve a little bit on. Unfortunately, all these things do require a bit of money and time, but I think we've got the dedicated staff to try and get there, and this sort of meeting hopefully get some feedback so we can take it on to make improvements in the future. But it's an interesting time to be in this unit, particularly with the qualified privilege arguments. And I think our final slide today is one that Claudia put in. I would personally, if I was a patient, which obviously I probably will be one day, you've got to ask your surgeon questions. And the surgeon should be aware of what their complication rates are like. Are they any good at doing this operation? I think one of the things we've been asked to do is actually produce consumer reports, which is going to be taxing us a little bit, but it's very true. And bottom line is, you should be asking your surgeon how many of these you've done, what your results like, can you guarantee that I'm not better off going to see somebody else? And that data should be available. Most of it's collected. The surgeons are possibly collecting it themselves. But it's up to the patients in many ways to say, okay, if they're not happy with what they've got, go and get a second opinion, which might be the bottom line from all of this. So that's the end of my little talk today.